My name is Ayodele Adio. I am a media executive, a politician, and to a very large extent, a reputation managing expert. Well, I mean, I think for almost a decade, I've run one of the fastest growing reputation management agencies in Lagos that provides um, strategic communications consultancy, policy communication services, for senior public officials, for government, for corporate agencies, and also media advisory services, generally speaking. So, to a very large extent, we've provided these strategic services for people um, in and out of government, and to a very large extent, for you to provide quality policy communication services, you must have um, grasp of those policies and a thorough understanding of the policies that you want to help, whether it's an agency, a development organization, or a government itself, to communicate it effectively to the public. And so we have worked in and around, or personally I've worked in and around many of these policy issues, whether it's economic, whether it's social, whether it's political, at least for a decade. And I would argue that my work has enabled me gain thorough understanding of these socio-economic and socio-political issues. Well, I'd argue that the main concern is that we're more political zones than we are economic zones. Even though in real sense, there's a lot of economic activity that can happen across the so-called geopolitical zones. But unfortunately, the emphasis has always been on our, geopolitical differences, and the emphasis has always been on politics, and unfortunately, not just politics, but identity politics, which focuses on our ethnic divisions and religious divisions, and that has tremendously held us backwards and held us down. So, I mean, I would argue that the number one problem that we have punches at each other, and having, this mutually assured destruction syndrome, where we're looking for the faults in some other persons than looking for the opportunities to collaborate. To put it in context, global poverty by 1991 had collapsed by at least 71%. To put it in proper context, billions of people had been lifted out of poverty, by the turn of the 1990s, and largely from India, China, South Asian economies. But between 1991 and more recently, since the last time I saw the figures, which was 2017, only 7 countries have expanded poverty in that period, while every other economy in the world was reducing poverty. Nigeria is one of those 7 countries who, since 1991, have expanded poverty line and increased the number of poor persons in that period. The last number I saw was that between that period, we have added 27 million poor people into the economy in that period. And that gives you context to show that our political economy hasn't worked, and whatever we're doing at the national, state, and local government hasn't delivered jobs, hasn't grown the economy, and to a very large extent, it's worsened the living conditions of Nigerians. It's even gotten worse in recent years, because if you look at our per capita income, which has collapsed from close to $2,000 sometimes in 2014 to about $827 as we speak today. It means that Nigerians are a lot more poorer than they were in 2014, and perhaps even are having the same living conditions as poorer Nigerians did in the 1960s. So this goes to tell you, or this goes to show you, that the economy hasn't delivered. It hasn't worked because the political elite have failed to deliver in it, and largely because we have failed or spectacularly failed to consolidate on the opportunities that are abundant, across the country. We have, like I said earlier, consistently focused, on our ethnicity, on our religion, and not about the collective growth of our people. And that has stagnated our economy and stagnated our people. Well, there are a few. There are a few here and there. Probably gambling. I think while those who have bet companies are making billions of the misery of young Nigerians, I think that many young Nigerians are having the short end of the stick because they are getting addicted and they are losing monies and losing their livelihoods due to this addiction. So I would say that gambling is one of those economic activities that is really crippling young people across the country, and that has to do with several other things. There's prostitution and things like that. But over the top of my head, if we're talking about formal economic activities, I would say gambling. Well, I'm not sure that you really can call. How do you describe illegal fishing? People were born and raised in the community and have always had access to the waters and have always fed from the fishes that they caught from those waters, and then somebody wakes up one morning and calls the activity illegal. So it's part of the common streak in Nigeria's political system where the elites tend to criminalize poverty. You take away their own opportunities and you soak it up to the big and connected. Because, again, somebody was born in a community in the riverine area where fishes have been their mainstay for generations, and suddenly somebody says it's illegal to fish, rather than create conditions upon which they can formalize that fishing activity, increase their income from that activity, and perhaps you also find a way to tax that activity reasonably, right? Rather than criminalize the entire process. The same thing with deforestation, and there hasn't been enough education on the impact of deforestation in terms of climate change and perhaps even more recently security. Because if you look at the most concentrated areas of terrorist activities in the northwestern part of the country, you will see that it's predominantly the Falgore forest that runs through northern Kaduna to Katsina to Zamfara. Now, these places used to be what you would call a game reserve back in the day, where you had forest guards who used to protect these game reserves or these forests. And over time, since they had been neglected and been abandoned, due to government negligence, over time, what has happened is that terrorists have encroached into those places and have dominated them. As you know, Sambisa Forest is also a similar case, where it used to be also some sort of a game reserve, right? So I think that government's inaction, to cede many of these spaces to non-state actors, a lack of long-term vision around what our forests should be and integrating them into our development trajectory, has led to the encroachment of non-state actors who have then used these ungoverned spaces for nefarious activities, and it's come back to bite us heavily and severely. Of course, it's government action, right? The fundamental purpose of government, even as defined by the Constitution, is the security and welfare of citizens. So government is directly responsible for your welfare and well-being, and to that extent, the economic growth of any country. So they are primarily responsible for that. So when a nation is pauperized, when a nation descends into abject poverty and lack, it's the government that you have to hold accountable, right? And the way you do that are by elections, where you change, um, politicians who have failed in the past, and perhaps vote better, more knowledgeable politicians who can move the economy forward. But I can argue also that the structure of our economy also plays a significant role. The over centralization of our economy, where you want to drive everything from Abuja, is also a clog in the wheel of our progress. I'd like to see a lot more decentralization, a lot more autonomy for local governments, where local solutions can be preferred at the local level. That way, you're likely to see, the engine of growth being propelled more from the local level, and that can be scaled at the state and national level, and perhaps will grow at a lot faster, um, rate than we have in more recent times. Well, nobody's going to support your development. People are out in pursuit of their own self-interest. So what Nigeria has to do is to look for countries where its self-interests are aligned around, and try to promote trade around those countries. And the low-hanging fruit typically will be to promote the free African trade agreement that happens within our region and our continent, to ensure that we increase trade within African and amongst African states. And that way, we are likely to grow the economy by at least, most conservative estimates, by 30%, right? So I like to see that we push for more trade within countries across Africa, and we lower the barriers of travel within the continent, and accelerate cooperations and collaborations between nation states amongst the continent. That way, we can spread wealth faster, lift more people out of poverty, and create more opportunities across. And then we can then start having conversations. Listen, we can work and chew gum at the same time. While we're doing that within the continent, we can also explore the opportunities across the globe. Whether it's exporting beef to Western countries, whether it's exporting mineral resources to countries like China, because there's a huge market for batteries as we speak today, and some of the inputs can be gotten from states like Nasarawa here in Nigeria, Plateau, some pockets of Taraba. And so the opportunities to export certain extractive materials to countries who are heavily industrializing, especially within the electric vehicle space. So there are opportunities in that regard to explore. But we have to understand that nobody's going to give you a sandwich. You have to align with the interest of people, the Global Committee of Nations, and you must cleverly advance your own interests with the right collaborations, and the right relationships, both continentally and internationally. Well, yes, I have seen that there have been clear intentions to join that bloc. I have not seen what is supposed to be a clear blueprint as to why we have joined and what the benefits of joining that group is going to portend for Nigeria. I do not fault that decision. I think it's also an important decision to trade with countries like Brazil, China, India, Turkey. It provides us a wide and huge market, but we also have to be prepared, internally, to be able to capitalize on these huge markets that are in some cases far more technologically advanced than we are. So it's not just about joining these regional blocks. Yeah, it's about what we're doing locally, to set up a system, what you call a comparative advantage, to benefit from these regional, arrangements. Well, to be very honest with you, like I said, nothing changes except you change fundamentally. So you can be a part of as much blocks as possible as you like. If you do not change the fundamentals within your economy to become a lot more productive, to become a lot more efficient, and to leverage on your strategic advantage or your comparative advantages, you will not make much from whatever association, groups, or blocks that you join, right? So it's about changing setting fundamentals within one's economy, building the right capabilities, the right skills and competencies, and be clear about your strategic objective and what you want to gain by aligning with whatever group, or block that you seek to join. Now, again, talking about how this has changed my perception of certain countries, I don't think it has done so much. I am for trade, and I'm open to trading. I want Nigeria to be open to trading with Brazil, with India, with China, with as much countries as possible, and exploring as much bilateral or multilateral opportunities that these countries will provide. Right. So I think it's a step in the right direction to have joined, but I'd like to see a lot more clarity in our strategic objective and what we're doing locally to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. Well, the security situation is tied to two principal things, which is a lack of state capacity to keep the peace within our borders, and the regional complexity that we find ourselves being wedged in the Sahel, where there are porosity of borders and where there are tensions between nation states as we speak at the moment, that has hindered the kind of collaboration that had once existed in dealing and combating this regional militia and terrorist organizations. So, except we're able to drastically improve state capacity, and that's by improving internal security, improving the capacity and the capability of the police to respond to some of these internal unrest, whether it's banditry or the rise of non-state actors, will continue to blink in the dark. There's also an economic angle to it. If we do not find a way to lift people out of poverty, if the only option people have to feed is to beg, borrow, or steal, what would happen is criminality will continue to thrive. Now there are TikTok videos of bandits brandishing brand new notes, foreign exchange from their escapades. That is feeding into the pool of criminals that are rising across the country, because they now imagine that they can become a millionaire by kidnapping one or two persons, or by ransacking an entire community, right? So if we don't deal with the conditions that creates the breeding ground that allows criminality, banditry, and terrorism to thrive, part of which is largely socio-economic, we are not going to make considerable progress. And if we don't, launch a regional approach, particularly in the Sahel, that puts us on the table with nation states, that leverages the carrot and stick approach, we will also find ourselves with the short end of the stick. So it's a multi-layered approach that involves building state capacity, that involves growing the economy, and that involves having a clear regional plan, that carries especially the Sahelian countries along, before we can be rest assured of having peace and stability in the next couple of years. Well, whether or not, it's hard for me to sit here and tell you how effective they can be, given the results that we are currently witnessing. But what I can tell you is that you cannot have a motivated military when you have a corrupt political elite. Now, except we deal with the corruption of the political class, except we deal with the divisions that are bound in our country, you're not going to have a single-minded, motivated military that will be willing to crush insurgents to protect and preserve our national sovereignty. And that, for me, is the bane and the major challenge that we face in crushing the rise of these non-state actors, and criminal elements, encroaching our country. worked for a period of time, but it fell apart when we threatened to invade Niger, and the moment the AES was formed, you know, some sort of a regional arrangement within certain Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Chad is still a bit in the middle, but that thwarted that joint military arrangements that we were building that delivered a few success stories. We'll need to build those kinds of regional alignments going forward if we're going to succeed against these criminals. Well, you see, you can collaborate with as much foreign partners as possible, but you have to take the lead. And that is the most important element. And I think we have everything it takes to take the lead in protecting our country and our territorial integrity. And of course, you can always have support, from the West. You can always have support from the East, should they want to provide. But there has to be leadership from one's own country to take the lead in protecting one's own country, because nobody is more invested in protecting your own country than you should be. And so if you're wallowing around and pussyfooting, you can't expect other countries to take leadership for you. What will happen is that your condition will be exploited, and that's what we have seen over the years. So while I'm open to collaboration, I'd like to see that we take leadership. Well, without mentioning particular countries, I think countries that are known to have exported terrorism, Nigeria should be careful with those kinds of countries. Countries that are known to export radical ideologies, Nigerians should also be careful with collaborations with those countries. Countries are constantly in competition. We're competing for resources, we're competing for capital inflows, we're competing for foreign direct investments, we're actually even competing for human capital, right? So countries are in constant competition, and the countries that we are the countries that provide the local conditions that attract the best talents to go into those countries. And if you do a comparative analysis, you will see that the countries that are more stable, the countries that are more open and receptive to global talent are the countries that are the most prosperous. And so if you want to be more competitive, you must open your economy to the global committee of nations. You must invest in infrastructure, you must invest in human capital development, and you must have a strong rule of law that is egalitarian and that is blind, to tribe, religion, or nation state. Well, you don't matter to them, let's put it bluntly. And, the idea, the hangover that we typically have, about these countries obsessing over Nigeria, I think is a bit far-fetched. Of course, you can say that, a country like China, giving its Belt and Road Initiative that it ran for about 15 years, demonstrated a little bit more empathy towards countries in Africa or like Nigeria by investing in critical road, rail, and port infrastructure across the continent. And like, Ekonjo Iweala once said recently that when we talk to Germany, they give us a lecture, and when we talk to China, they give us a bridge and a port. So in more recent times, you have seen more infrastructure exchange or benefits from countries like China, than from Western countries. But that obviously doesn't still negate, the fact that the reason we haven't enjoyed as much from Western countries is because of high corruption within our economy, a lot of red tapes and bottlenecks, and sometimes our resistance in certain regards not to be exploited by these Western interests. So it's about walking a fine line and a fine balance between national interests and encouraging foreign trade, And that's the fine line that we have to walk as a country, and that's where you need very competent diplomats who can help navigate this very complex and dynamic world that we live in today. None has been quite clear. I don't think that we have gone beyond what has been the norm in our country, at least over the last 2 decades, in terms of relations with Russia, China, or United States of America. And there's not been a significant deviation from what has been obtainable in the past. So it's hard to say that we're strengthening or we have untangled any sort of relationship within these three countries. What I can say is that Russia is also seeking opportunities to make inroads into Nigeria, as it has many other countries in Africa. But I would argue that the posture of this current administration has not really demonstrated a willingness to embrace Russian influence as some other African countries have done. It appears that we still lean, or this administration still leans towards favoring Western relationships than it is pivoting east. But again, it's still, we have a very competent, in my opinion, Minister for Foreign Affairs who speaks quite coherently, seems to be a very, very brilliant diplomat, if you ask me. And I think that he's handled this complexity quite brilliantly. He hasn't completely demonstrated, alignment with any bloc or with any continent or with any nation, and I sort of walked that fine line, pretty well. But I haven't really seen a complete departure from what has existed over the last 10 years. Of course, I'd like to see us step up trade. There's no doubt about it. Whether it's trade with China, trade with the United States, I'd like to see us step up trade and leverage some of our international influence, or the influence of some of our sons that are placed highly in many international organizations, to see how we can radically boost trade with many of these countries. Because once we increase trade, we create wealth and we grow our economy. Well, it hasn't, but of course, like a lot of NGOs have been greatly affected. The distribution of certain medicines, had been disrupted. But if you've listened to the Minister of Health and the President, who had also alluded to this, we seem to have invested more in providing some of these vaccines, in providing some of these drugs like the HIV drugs, to sort of, bridge the lacuna that the absence of the USAID has created. I think it has left a bad taste in the mouth of certain nation states, but I would argue that it has also encouraged them to step up and not be dependent, on handouts from Western countries and organizations, and rely on their pity and empathy rather than developing the internal capabilities to respond to internal health challenges. I haven't read in detail what the arrangement is supposed to look like. I've heard of it, but I haven't studied in detail what that arrangement is supposed to look like, and so I can't speak to it intelligently as to how it will affect us, or whether or not it will promote or hinder our own interests. Well, again, nothing has changed fundamentally for the Americans. The Chinese have always sought to improve and increase trade and partnerships with Nigeria, and that trend has continued over the last decade. Russia, on its own hand, I would argue, is sort of trying to it's trying to gain inroads through the media, and it's playing the media narrative within Nigeria. Like I said, the administration has not postured itself as being receptive to Russian influence yet, and perhaps maybe that is what has informed the Russian strategy of going through trying to influence young Nigerians with the media. But aside that, I just haven't seen a radical departure from the trend over the last decade. China has increased collaboration. The United States has been quite stable, um, and Russia has been trying to gain inroads. But I mean, it depends on what you're sending the child to learn, obviously. But of course, Western universities still rank, top in many parts of the world. So obviously, it depends on what the child is going to study or is going to learn. But the leading schools in the United States are still the global leaders of knowledge across the world, and that would have, I'll certainly have a preference for that. But obviously, there are a lot of technological capabilities that you can learn and develop from China, and so it's also quite an interesting opportunity to explore if you want to build, certain local capabilities. Well, we have to be polygamous. You don't have to choose one. You know, work with as much as possible. Um, Whatever the Chinese offer that benefits your country, please be happy to embrace it. Whatever the Americans offer, what the Russians offer, I don't think it's a one size fits all, and I don't think they are mutually exclusive. You just have to pursue national interest, and whichever country provides that at any given point in time, we should be open, to collaborations and partnerships with them. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's a direct infringement on our territorial integrity. So I don't support having military bases in my country. I mean, well, look, I consume media from across, really and truly. Um, yeah, it's hard to even start to from across. I'm subscribed to so many international media organizations. I watch Al Jazeera, CNN, local news, so it's just hard to limit. Yes, President Tinubu is pursuing a market-led economy. So my singular advice to him is that typically market-led economy functions on the principle of a trickle-down economics, that the successes that people get at the top will trickle to the bottom. And so my cardinal advice would be that it actually never trickles down. And so you have to provide adequate social services or social welfare nets for those that are being left behind while pursuing this market-led, policies. The cost of living crisis is being humongous, and so there needs to be a lot more support in terms of social safety nets for the poor. And then for citizens, I would argue that somehow you just have to find a way to reskill and improve your skills so that you're open to not just local but international opportunities, as the case may be, and not be completely reliant on yesterday's knowledge or what you graduated with from university, so that you can open yourself to more opportunities across.
Thank you so much for your time. Forever Purpose.
Thank you.
And your very destination.
Ayodele Adio. I am a media executive and a politician.